The World Food Programme issues an emergency call for funds as the price of basic necessities skyrockets. But will rich countries rush to help the world's poorest? And can a human catastrophe be averted? This is Inside Story. The World Food Programme has issued an urgent appeal to address the increasing needs of the world's poor. But this deepening crisis is not due to just earthquakes, war or famine. It's because prices are rising worldwide and the value of the US dollar is falling. So the UN says an extra $500 million in aid is needed to cover the shortfall for 2008 alone. Since June last year, the worldwide cost of fuel and food has shot up by 55% on average. Now, that spells bad news for more than 73 million people worldwide who rely on the UN for food handouts. And increased living costs also means that more people than ever will have to rely on handouts for their survival, putting the World Food Programme under intense pressure. The fear is now that the UN agencies may simply not be able to cope. Well, actually, sharp declines were reported in the commodity markets this week, but food prices are still very high, and that's due to several factors. 2 years of poor wheat and barley harvest has seen a sharp spike in the price of staple grains. Then there's the growing trend of Western governments to use grains for biofuel production, which one day they hope will provide an alternative to oil and gas. Then the soaring population in the developing world, particularly in India and China, has pushed a huge surge in demand for grains. According to the UN, the worst hit will be countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which is still racked by famine and civil war. As the largest annual aid contributor, it's the US that's expected to shoulder the largest part of the added burden. But it remains to be seen whether it can deliver. Very warm welcome. I'm Jane Dutton. But joining us now are our guests in Brussels, Nerj Deva, member of the European Parliament's Development Committee. In Rome, Arif Hussain, a senior food security analyst at the World Food Programme. And in Washington, D.C., John Hodinot, a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. Mr. Hussain, has feeding the world become a losing battle?
No, it's... We are optimistic. This is a difficult time for WFP. One of the problems, or as you well know, is that WFP is a voluntarily funded organization. So we depend on the governments, we depend on private sector, and we depend on individual people to donate money. At this time, what is happening is that there are two basic things which are going on. One is that the food commodity prices, as you well know, are increasing. At the same time, the price of oil is increasing. And when oil and fuel prices increase, that means that everything else increases. So we are in a situation where the people who are in need, they're actually increasing. And at the same time, our response capacity in terms of having the resources to help these people is on a decline.
Now, you've called for extra resources. If you don't get it in the timeline that you've scheduled for, will you be cutting supplies?
What is really important right now is that this $500 million extra dollars, which we are asking for, this is to meet our existing 2008 demand, basically, for the neediest of the world. And what is the real urgency here is to get the money as soon as possible, so we are in a position to actually take that money, convert it into what is needed, and get it to the people who are in need of that.
Mr. Deva, excuse me interrupting here. Excuse me interrupting. Mr. Deva, how did we get to this point? Surely there must have been some warning signs on the ground and in the corridors of power, Mr. Deva.
Yes, there has been. It has been ignored. The number of people now we are feeding, especially in Africa and the Horn, is about 5.5 million people a day. And the World Food Programme does an excellent job doing that. In Zimbabwe, we are feeding about 3.5 million people. But the trouble is that by the time this program is finished, and it's very good of you to put this program out at this time. In the half an hour or so that we will have this program, do you know that about 25 people would have died of starvation? So we are in a tragic situation here, where half the world is dieting, and $500 million is probably what they pay for gym fees in the West every day, $500 million.
So do you think this suggests a lack of political will to resolve this problem? Has the world's emphasis shifted to the wars, to the global spread of terrorism, for example?
Our focus has been elsewhere. We have increasing numbers of people suffering in Darfur, in Ethiopia, in Zimbabwe, or in the Horn of Africa. Refugee camps in Bangladesh for 20 years, they're still there, they're still being fed. But we have focused on other things. Now, biofuels, take biofuels for example. I'm determined if the last thing I do to stop grain, food that can go into people's mouths, being diverted into motor cars and lorries and biodiesel. I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to pass, as much as I can, in the European Parliament, a regulation saying that all biofuels must be from non-edible sources, like cellulose, from jatropha, elephant grass, which human beings can't consume. At the moment, wheat prices have doubled from $100 a ton to $200 a ton. And the director of the World Food Program told me that about 30% of what she would have been getting in wheat pricing has gone to buying biofuels for our vehicles.
Okay, let's bring Mr. Hoddinott in here. I mean, if we are using food to fuel our cars, are you pleased with what you're hearing coming from the European Union? Will this make an impact?
It'll certainly have some positive impact. The use of biofuels has accounted for about 25% of the increase in demand for cereals such as maize since 2000. So efforts that switch biofuels away from things like maize and towards things like elephant and switchgrass are to be welcomed.
How do you get that balance, though, between feeding the poor and preventing the environmental impact?
Well, I think one of the big issues here is the extent to which biofuels are subsidized in Western countries. A lot of this comes down to incentives. Setting the incentives right, and a lot of these problems can be resolved.
Okay, Mr. Hussain, you talk about the World Food Program, talks about the new face of poverty. What does that face look like?
Well, the main thing there is that you have new caseloads coming in, new people who were able to, before this crisis, who were able to make ends meet, are now going to be unable to do that. For instance, people who depend on the market, for example, people who are urbanites working on fixed salaries, and now with this situation, given both the fuel as well as the commodity thing, their purchasing power has declined as a lot, basically.
So is it a case that the food is on the shelves, but they actually can't get to those shelves?
Yes, in certain cases, food is on the shelves and they cannot get to. And this kind of, what is really important here is to understand that, like in the Western countries, we spend maybe 10% of our income to get the food. In the poorest of the poor countries right now, people spend as much as 80% of their household income on food. So now when the prices go up, what are they supposed to do? I mean, you know, there's going to be, okay, instead of 80, now they're going to be spending maybe 90% of their income on that. And in terms of getting that 10% more, what are they losing? You will have less expenses on education, on health. And what that means is that the effect of this is not only people being hungry, but also people being less healthy and people being less educated. And we have to see this issue in a bigger context.
Okay, let's bring in the bigger context here. Mr. Hoddinott, I mean, what role for big business? Should they look to local and regional markets?
That can certainly play a role. One of the proposals put forward by the World Food Program is to increasingly source their food aid in developing countries. That will require resources that come from richer countries in North America, in Europe, in the Middle East, to provide WFP with cash. But doing so will provide a means of stimulating local markets and also, in many cases, reducing the cost of transporting food to those who need it.
I will be looking into that in more detail after the short break. We'll also be talking about the consequences of any food aid shortage on the millions of poor people worldwide. Stay with us.